This is an IWP media production, brought to you by the Institute of World Politics, the independent accredited graduate school empowering the next generation of national security, intelligence, and international affairs experts. Learn from top scholar practitioners and acquire invaluable skills to propel your career. For more information, visit iwp.edu.
Hello, welcome to the IWP podcast. I'm Jim Robbins, the Dean of Academics at IWP. Our guest today is David Glancy, IWP Professor of Strategy and Statecraft and Annenberg Chair in International Communication. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for hosting me today.
You're welcome. David is also a former official at the State Department and Defense Department, who has also done consulting for government agencies and private sector firms. David, before we start talking, how about telling the audience what you teach here at IWP?
Sure, Jim, thanks. So I teach a number of classes here at IWP. I teach propaganda, so looking at the history of propaganda and different techniques that states use to influence both decision makers and the general public. I teach a class on political warfare, which is more strategic and looks at strategy and how states have used instruments of statecraft as part of political warfare strategies throughout history. I also teach a class on economic statecraft, which covers economic statecraft and economic warfare. And then also, finally, I teach a class on forecasting and political risk analysis.
Fascinating. You know, there aren't a lot of programs in international security or foreign affairs that teach courses like that.
This is true, and I've been here now 11 years. It's been a great 11 years here, and teaching these classes before a lot of these topics were really hot and in the news was, I think, especially important. I look occasionally around to see what other schools are teaching, and really, there's no one teaching classes like we do. There's some now that have talked a little bit about Russian active measures or sort of small parts of some of these activities, but really to get the holistic approach, there's no one doing it the way we do it. And I think, learning the history, learning how these instruments of statecraft have been used in the past, that's really been lost to some extent. And I think It's really important that future policymakers, officials, understand this, and that I think really helps our students when they graduate, because they're able to understand the history, understand not just theory, but also how to actually put together a strategy and use these different tools that we have, so that you can influence different actors, you can try to shape the world so that you don't have to have crises or just resort to the military because we've let things sort of get out of hand.
Oh, right. I mean, political warfare is a real and ongoing thing in the world.
Yes, and it's, I think, one of the challenges, both society and also for leaders. We think of conflict and war as black and white. It's binary. We're either at war or we're at peace. And there's this whole other space of competition, competing for influence, trying to increase your strength and weaken your adversaries, that's going on under the surface that we haven't been on the field for since the end of the Cold War, frankly.
Oh, right. Yeah, we used to be very good at it.
And we had some hiccups at the start after World War II, but we had the existential threat. We understood strategy. We had strategists. And then we understood the threat of the Soviet Union and were able to develop policies and political warfare activities to counter that. And we really haven't been doing that much. I mean, there's been occasional activities, but not sort of in a strategic approach since the end of the Cold War, and that I think has cost us.
Oh, definitely. When you look at what China's up to, what Russia's up to, even Iran, any of these countries, it seems like they have a concept, they have a strategy, they're pursuing it. And as you say, we're not on the field. We're just spectators almost.
And they're good at it. They have organizations for these activities. They put money to it. That's part of their strategy. So they're doing things, but they're not sort of omnipotent or 10-foot giants, and you sometimes see their mistakes. But they look even better at this and have made a lot of gains because, as you say, we haven't been on the field. So that's been problematic, and that sort of gets us to where we're at. Think of, Iran has called the U.S. the Great Satan. How many years now?
Since the revolution?
Yes,
Yeah.
so 40-some years. So what if we had actually taken them seriously, that we were an adversary, and actually used the different instruments of statecraft, military, diplomacy, information, economic, to put pressure on the regime for those 40-plus years? I think we'd have a very different Iran. I think we'd have a very different Middle East than we do today. And we've paid attention to Iran occasionally, but we really haven't developed a political warfare strategy to deal with Iran in a sort of comprehensive way, which I think really could have limited their ability to expand their presence through the Middle East. They're having really hard economic times, but if we had been able to put pressure on them for 40 years, I think it'd be, again, a very different situation.
Oh, yeah, it astonishes me when we have these periodic uprisings in Iran of people in the streets saying, death to the dictator and stuff like this, and we don't do much of anything.
And if we haven't done things to prepare the sort of groundwork, then it's probably better to not do something than to do it badly. Doing political warfare poorly, you get your own people or your people you're working with killed, and it can look very bad for your country. But if we actually had, even since 2009, they had the Green Movement in 2009. We didn't do anything because we didn't have the contacts, we didn't have people in place to work with, we didn't have a great understanding of the dynamics there. But if we had spent the last 15 years working on that, and then when they have these different protests, when you have the government not popular, we actually could have taken advantage of that and helped. But because we haven't done the cultural intelligence, opportunities intelligence, we really don't have those contacts, so we aren't able to do anything there to really put pressure on the government.
So we need to take a long-term view of this strategic approach, kind of like with the Cold War.
I think so. Political warfare is not a silver bullet. It's not going to rescue a bad policy. It's not, like calling in the special forces. You can't do that at the end usually and rescue a failed or flawed policy. But with some planning and with some actually putting time in, it's a midterm to long-term strategy. But it can pay very big dividends. And so that's, I think we need to be investing much more into that. And, who in the U.S. government on the policy side is actually in charge of political warfare?
Great question. The Global Engagement Center?
They do online a little bit, but there's no one in the U.S. government. I mean, we have people in the agencies and in the military that can do sort of carrying out some of the political warfare activities, but you don't want them developing policy.
Right.
And back in the Cold War, at the start of the Cold War, it was State Department's policy planning. Right now, that's where Kennan was, and then NHTSA. Right now, we don't have an organization that's really dedicated to this. And I think that's really a problem, and something hopefully the next administration may start taking it seriously and do something more on that front, because we have tight budgets. We need to innovate and spend more on defense, but that's not because of our deficits. We can't go crazy there. And political warfare, the cost of employing people, doing additional broadcasting, it's pennies on the dollar compared to a new aircraft or weapon system and all. But it can yield huge dividends.
Well, I hope that some future policymakers are listening and that they will take this cost-effective, strategically critical step. Looking around the world right now, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal that has been creating some buzz by Yaroslav Trofimov on the West's next challenge, the rising axis of autocracies. And he's talking about how the coming together partnership of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and presumably other adversary states is creating pressure on the United States, especially in terms of keeping our deterrence credible. As was it Keith Kellogg, Lieutenant General, retired Army, said, it's like a game of whack-a-mole with all the moles up. So the question is, can the United States cope with having all the moles up, or do we have to find some kind of accommodation to, do we need some kind of strategic shift in order to mitigate these things or drive a wedge between these different countries?
I think looking at wedges and trying to break, part of political warfare, if you can break apart alliances, if you can diminish capabilities, that can be helpful. These countries are cooperating, and I think someone in the article mentioned that the ties are getting a little thicker, but they still have, they don't agree on everything. There's still some frictions between Russia and China. How do we exploit that? How do we break that apart? I think that's a question worthwhile, that's worthwhile to explore, but I think we also have to be careful and understand the world how it is. One of the things that we teach here and one of the things I try to emphasize to the students is seeing the world how it actually is. You can work on and try to change it how we want it to be, but being realistic about how things really are, how states operate. I think that's been part of the problem, that wishful thinking and naivete and not understanding the history and how states generally behave. That got to help get us into this problem. So being realistic about how much we can drive them apart. I think limiting, increasing the price of cooperation is one area that I think is important. So, China, according to the public reports, they haven't shipped a lot of weapons or real weapons to the Russians. They're still fearful of our secondary sanctions and being hit with some of the economic sanctions that could come with that. They've given parts, they've given things that can be assembled, but from what I've seen online, they haven't really done a lot or done anything in the weapons side. So that's been partially effective. The threat of sanctions to limit some of their cooperation. Highlighting China's behavior with Russia, supporting Russia how it has, though economically with trade and with some of the components and material for war, but not the actual weapons. Highlighting that to the Europeans. The Europeans are very concerned about the war, Russia and Ukraine, and China's been a supporter of Russia. So how do we work with our European allies and friends to increase the cost to China for its support to Russia? Right. I think that's, how do we increase costs to Iran for its support to Russia, which reportedly has been actually sending missiles and drones. So, right. Can we get the Europeans on board for tougher sanctions there? So putting more pressure on those states, I think, is the best approach. I think someone in the article mentioned having a grand bargain with the Russians and thinking that would. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, right, yes, I wanted to discuss that because there is this, it's in the article and you hear people talking about it, this kind of bold strategic move, or what they call a reverse Kissinger, where instead of the opening to China in the 1970s, which incidentally it was just like the classic three-power play where the two weaker parties ganging up on the third party. Not that we were necessarily weaker than the Soviet Union, but they definitely had strategic momentum back in the 1970s. And then so the idea here would be that the United States and Russia would be natural allies against China in this particular grand bargain scenario. I think there's some definite problems with it. I don't know if it's possible. I don't know if it makes any sense whatsoever, but it's out there. People are talking about it. So what do you think?
I think it's fantasy and wishful thinking. To be quite frank. When I was in government at the Pentagon, did some work on Russia issues, and there was an attempt to cooperate early 2000s. There was optimism. There was attempt to cooperate.
Right. They were a partnership for peace country.
They were, yep. And and even some of the different treaties we actually did do some nuclear reductions, but there was always a level of mistrust, and I think, and there people were talking about scenarios back then about the U.S. coming to Russia's aid in a war with China because China was taking territory in Western Russia and stuff. I think on paper we have no territorial ambitions. They're an educated population. On paper it seems like there should be some cooperation or ability to cooperate. The reality and personalities and history, I think, gets in the way of that, and that it's not really possible. In the economic statecraft class, we actually looked at Putin and Putin's economy. And for about 15 years, he really isolated the Russian people, the Russian economy, to try to sort of mitigate foreign interference and the ability to sanction him if he was doing his bad behavior. And it really cost the people of Russia a great deal. It limited investment there, it limited opportunities, it limited their economic growth for the last 15, 20 years. And and my point at the time was, this was before the Ukraine invasion, if you think Russia's going to change its behavior, look at the economic side. It's really, their words are, take that for what they're worth, but actions mean a lot more. So if Putin was going to really change and open up to the West and change his behavior of interfering around the world, you'd see that in his economic policies and his economic opening up. And he, again, intentionally isolated his economy to try to be able to meddle in the world and limit the damage that the West could do via sanctions.
Yes.
And so, I think...
Which they've done.
Yes, yeah. But the sanctions are having a major impact in the brain drain and all of that. But it's, I don't think, if he wanted to change, if the country wanted to actually be partners, I think you'd be able to see that by their actions actually withdrawing. It wouldn't take a U.S. overtures to this. I think, again, that's just kind of folly. And, going to China, you have a similar Xi's taking his economy. They're, trying to do more domestically,
Yes.
not have reliance on foreign technology, foreign equipment, and so, whether or not that's going to lead to conflict or just China, continuing to have its sort of bellicose relationship or bellicose actions, I think, if China wants to change, it could. We'd see that again in their economic actions, not just, sort of words to big businesses and international investors that they're open and they want good things.
Yeah, I think the whole engagement strategy is dead now, and any notion that we're going to reopen to China is kind of silly. And with respect to Russia, as you said, I mean, what we teach here at this school is reality. And
Yeah.
the reality is that it would only benefit Russia for the United States to have that opening. It wouldn't benefit us whatsoever. And Vladimir Putin is a guy who bemoans the collapse of the Soviet Union. He wants to recreate that. He even wants to recreate the Russian Empire. And he's not going to change his tune. And I always tell my students to go read Putin's essay from 6 months before the invasion of Ukraine, 25-page essay arguing how Ukraine has no right to exist. I mean, he telegraphed it.
Yeah.
He's very open about these things.
Yeah.
And the notion of, oh, we're going to like woo Putin somehow, woo him, what the, you know, what that's like, it's accommodation, it's surrendering, appeasement, yeah.
Yeah.
There's no wooing, it's just we giving up.
And, you know, offer up, let's see, the Baltics, maybe Poland or part of Poland, and, you know, how much more would we have to actually, you know, keep giving to maybe eventually get him to sort of stop. But the idea that Russia's going to help us with China is absurd. And, you know, and to be clear-eyed about, you know, China and China's interests and actions, a year or two ago, I guess it was a little bit 6 months or a year after the invasion, reportedly diplomats were going to Europe and telling them that, you know, they lost Russia, they lost the cheap energy, they can't afford to lose China as well. So they need to be more independent from the U.S. So that was a very, you know, sort of threat that, you know, they needed to keep good relations with China.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd kind of turn that on its head, and in our economic and cultural and diplomatic and, you know, ties, you've lost to the Europeans, you've lost Russia, you can't afford to lose the U.S. because we have, you know, as much trade and business that China does, we also have, you know, huge relationships with the European economy, and it's very intertwined. And I mean, trade and economics can be part of an economic warfare strategy. How do we deepen and increase ties, you know, with the Europeans? You know, there's been some talk about different trade agreements or increasing some trade opportunities and lowering tariffs and barriers with the Europeans. To me, that's a political warfare strategy, and that makes sense economically, but also, you know, strategically.
Right, and let's always remember that China's number one or number two, probably number one strategic goal is to drive a wedge between the United States and Europe.
Yeah.
Is to split up the free world,
Yeah.
because they're still communists. This was the Soviet Union's main objective in everything that they did, trying to drive a wedge between us, trying to break up NATO. And now China's doing it. And so it's no surprise at all that Chinese diplomats are telling the Europeans they have to be more independent of the United States, of course, because it would weaken them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's what China would love to see. And if the United States started talking about, oh, we're going to have an opening to Russia or something like that, that would also achieve China's goal, because the Europeans would have to look elsewhere for protection.
Yeah, and look inward and just, it wouldn't be good.
Okay, summing it up, it wouldn't be good. Incidentally, and I just want to plug something here for a second, but on September 12th, IWP is co-hosting a panel with the National Review Institute talking about this very issue, and other related issues, the strategic challenges they're going to face the next administration, whoever it is, because these issues are not going away. It doesn't matter who we elect. Who we elect may make these issues worse, depending. We're not going to get into politics, but in any case, on September 12th, IWP and National Review Institute, we're going to have a little panel discussion, a little debate over the future of U.S. policy with respect to these strategic challenges. So if you're interested, then check it out on our website, iwp.edu, or check out the National Review Institute website. and you can get all the information.
And you had a good comment there that this isn't going away.
No.
These states are they're structured. Their political warfare organizations are structured for the long term. They know how to do this stuff. They've studied it. Again, they have organizations and money and strategy behind it. It's not going away. They're taking this stuff seriously, and we need to manage the current crises. We have a lot of strengths. Thankfully, our adversaries have a lot of weaknesses.
Yes.
Russia, the economic, demographic, China, also, its wolf warrior diplomacy has backfired to some extent. So you're getting states to actually recognize what China's ambitions really are. They have demographic problems. They're having economic challenges, which Xi's policies are making even worse.
Right.
And so they're, not going to be, I think, some economists have said that their peak GDP was, maybe a few years ago.
Interesting.
And so, if that's true, they don't have the market that, the Europeans and others thought they were going to have. Foreign firms are being shut out of that market, and it's going more towards Chinese national firms. So it's not, sort of the golden opportunity that it once presented itself. And I think, there's really going to be some, potentially some, disruptions and internal challenges for the Chinese government, just because, they changed their unemployment statistics, and they're back at a new high.
Interesting.
And so they took out people in college, basically. Because they stopped reporting the numbers for a while because they were so bad. They reconfigured it. They're reporting the numbers, and the numbers are still getting even worse. So they're going to have some real challenges. The amount of money coming out of China has hit some records. So, and again, there's a tie between economic statecraft and political warfare, and economic warfare is part of a political warfare strategy. And, if you have an adversary, how do you, limit their growth? And it's got to be a balance. We need to manage the current crises. We need to look to the medium, longer term. But what can we put in place so that, we don't get into a hot war, but we put pressure on these countries?
Right.
In different ways, information, internal. I think it's also, defense. We need to increase our cyber capabilities because our
Big time.
cyber weaknesses and vulnerabilities have been, very much exploited, and I think that's a real vulnerability for us. And that's also somewhat limits our ability to conduct political warfare because we do have some of these vulnerabilities. And but I don't think you're going to see these actors changing their tactics unless they're not just going to abandon things that have been working. So how do we get, what can we do to put pressure on them, to threaten things that they value, so that we can get them to change their tactics and their policies a bit?
Right. TikTok has been in the news a lot lately about how they use that as a tool, like their internal version of TikTok and the export version are different algorithms, different limitations. Like unlimited for us, like our kids can get on it and use it 24 hours a day, but in China they restrict it.
And that's, I think, the Soviets had a strategy for distracting, sort of weakening societies to some extent. If you get people to not be able to pay attention for more than 15 seconds, that can have an impact on education, on other things, and that can be something that weakens a society. And so, I hope the ban, I think the ban should have been in place and moved forward a while ago. China's not going to sell TikTok, I don't think. They're not going to provide an algorithm that makes it so effective to someone else. I think it's going to go away in the U.S. Because it is seen as, I mean, it's their one major sort of cultural influence social media platform that can compete with Facebook or X or Instagram. And so they're going to take that and export that around the world. If they lose the U.S. market, that's going to be, both economically a setback, but also kind of diplomatically, and prestige-wise. But they're not gonna sell to U.S. investors because that would be, you'd have to give away the secret sauce of the algorithm to really make it valuable for someone to buy, and that's a national secret for them. So that's a national security issue. So they're not going to do that.
Yeah,
so.
that alone should tell you something. That,
well, they lots of things are national security. The level of pollution and other things they have as national security. They call national security and limit reporting. So.
Well, speaking of national security and political warfare and the interface with politics, we recently saw reports that the Iranians are trying to interfere with the election, hacking into the Trump campaign, allegedly attempting to hack into the Democrats. We've seen allegations of Russian interference, Chinese interference, not just in the last election, not just in 2016, but as our founder, Dr. Lanchowski, notes, this has been going on since the days of the Comintern. I mean,
yes.
It started in, Woodrow Wilson's day.
Yes.
And there was a memo that he wrote when he was on the National Security Council in the 1980s detailing Russian attempts to interfere in our election during the Reagan administration. It looked very much like what Russia was attempting to do in 2016. And whether or not you think that had any influence on that election, I mean, the fact is that our enemies are out there trying to influence events here corruptly. Could it even throw an election? I mean, what do you think?
It could, but I think the reach, it's really hard to actually get people to change their core beliefs. It's hard to get people to get up off the couch and actually go vote or change their vote. So I think I'm a little bit skeptical of that. I think, we have to, and education is a great defense. So we weren't prepared in 2016. I worked on a campaign in 2008, and there were warnings about interference and hacking attempts and phishing attempts back then. So this is something that's not new. We should have been on guard for it more. I think, the rise of deep fakes, something tactical at the very last minute could potentially shift things. But I think it was Slovakia, there was an audio recording that was faked and released, and that actually seems to have made an impact, I think, in their prime minister or presidential elections. I'm not sure which it was, but so that's something to be wary of, because it's hard to, there's little time to debunk it and get new information out. So, we're always, I've been involved in political campaigns and things since longer than I want to say, let's say. And so, there's always been talk of an October surprise. So I think, we do need to be on guard for that. If it's, again, last minute, that might be something that could sway some, voters, but we're so polarized right now, and people are, how many actual people are influenceable at this point in the U.S.? And, this was one of the longest presidential campaigns we've had. We have to be on guard, and I think it's a concern, but I'm not as sort of concerned as some of the commentators and folks out there, because I think there's so much information that goes out. The disinformation that comes from within the U.S. and from our own citizens
Oh, yeah.
overwhelms and swamps any kind of external activities. So
it's true. I mean, if you look at the amount of money that Russia allegedly spent on Facebook in 2016, it was like 1% of what the Clinton campaign was spending on Facebook. And if you actually looked at the Russian propaganda they were spewing out, it was so crude.
Yeah.
I mean, any kind of, meme person in this country would have been 1,000 times more effective than the extremely crude propaganda that the Russians were pushing out in that election. And so, yeah, I agree. It's a question, number one, are people influenceable? And the other is, do the foreign propagandists have what it takes?
Yeah. And the Russians, though, they did do a great job by highlighting and getting us to fight about it after the fact.
Right.
That's where, they've really got they've got more than their money's worth in that investment, because we've been, fighting about it for the last 8 years.
Yeah.
And how much influence did they have? Partly the way they did it left, it was clear that they were doing it. They weren't that careful about it. And then they sort of hyped it after the fact. And then once it got into sort of the news and the political sphere, then the two sides took their positions and have been fighting it out since. And so that was, and the Russians are very good at exploiting seams and exploiting issues. They don't have to create those. They can just kind of push on things that are already there.
Oh, right.
They kind of created this one, but once it was out there, then they kind of flamed it a little bit, and then we took over and have sort of helped them with this. And that's been, I think, the most effective part of their campaign in 2016 was getting us to fight about it afterwards and not agree about what the actual impact was, because, as you say, it was small, not that many people saw it, it wasn't that good. A few people might have gone to a rally, maybe, but that, not enough to sway an election, even as close as it was. So I think, I don't think it swayed that election.
No, it probably didn't sway one vote.
Yeah. But they certainly got us to be fighting about how much it did, and did it or didn't it for,
Oh, yeah. And for them, that's a win. I mean, that's
Absolutely.
all they want to do, is have us fight each other. And when one side in the political debate suddenly turns it into an issue, they win.
Yeah, and that's, again, education and understanding what these states do and what they want to do and their goals. I think that's a huge way to defeat some of the political warfare. The news organizations didn't publish the documents that they got. We knew more about why these states wanted to do this, where it was coming from. So that, I think, is, a big help. It's this is going to continue. Educating people, again, I think is key.
There's this notion that the United States is the indispensable country, and we've heard this for years. As we see relative decline in our GDP, as we see our ballooning debt, relatively, it's over World War II levels now. Decline in our military capabilities, decline in U.S. influence, weakening of our deterrent, and things like this. Is the U.S. still the indispensable country?
Absolutely. Who else would take up the mantle? The British passed it to the U.S. after World War II, basically saying, we've been helping the Greeks in the Civil War. We're going to stop. I forget, it was March or April. Good luck. And that helped lead to the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. And, we have challenges, but we also have a free society. We have innovation. We have a market economy that can respond. We have innovation. People can still, create Googles and Microsofts and make a lot of money and keep a lot of that money and increase our efficiencies. our economy's grown. We need to do something, I think, about spending. That's a problem. And but there's no other country that's going to be the reserve currency in the world.
Well, the BRICS would argue with you, but maybe that's a topic for another
Yeah,
time.
we can. I'm happy to come back and talk about more economic stuff. But there's China can't do it. I mean, think about if to have the reserve currency, you have to let it float freely and be freely exchanged. What would happen tomorrow? So tomorrow morning, Beijing time, they say we're gonna let go of any kind of currency controls, let their currency float, and we're just going to be part of a regular. Well, there's a couple challenges. They export more than they import, so that's a problem. But then, just let's say if it happened, what would that cause? What would be 9 a.m. banks open, markets open in Beijing. They announce it at 8:55. What happens?
You tell me.
Everybody in China takes their money and moves it to the U.S., Canada, Switzerland, Great Britain. Their currency plunges.
So it's the short selling opportunity of a lifetime.
Yeah, it's that's basically. But that would kind of crash their currency, and they're not going to do that. So they're not going to do that. Japan, too small, shrinking population. British, too small, not going to. Europe, they're having challenges and issues with economic growth. I mean, the U.S., it's amazing. In the last 30 years, the standard of living and economic growth between U.S. and our European allies and partners has grown about, I think it's grown a lot. I don't know the percentages, but I want to say 20 to 30%, that we're 20 to 30% more wealthy in the U.S. today than we were 20, 30 years ago with our Europeans, to the Europeans. So we have cheap energy. We have, still a formidable military. Hopefully we're learning the lessons from the Ukraine conflict because others are, but being innovative, smaller weapon systems, and again, if we can keep the peace and not go to extremes, getting into a hot war, managing relations with, but putting pressure on our adversaries, but trying to manage those relationships for a few more years, I think we're in actually a great place because we still have a free society, entrepreneurship, market economy. You can make more or lose more in the U.S. than just about anywhere else in the world. So that gives us a lot of strengths. And I think looking back at the Cold War, we can't compare sort of exactly this new challenge to the Cold War, but there are some similarities. And I think our system of democracy, of openness, of innovation, that's what really defeated the Soviet Union. And so how do we strengthen those things at home, even getting our economic house in order, education house in order, being strong at home will help us be stronger abroad as well. But I still think I'm long on the U.S. Let's just put it that way.
Okay. Well, I'm glad it's not all doom and gloom. Well, David, I want to thank you for coming on our podcast today. This is David Glancy, professor at IWP. And for IWP, I'm Jim Robbins. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again next week.
If you like our podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe. And if you are interested in learning more about the topics we covered here today and want to be a student at IWP, go to iwp.edu and click Apply Now.